Hey guys, so this sushi order is going to be like $42. What should I leave? Like a $2 tip?
No, you need to tip at least 20%.
Why is that?
Well, restaurant workers need their tips. It's how they can. It's the only way they can make a full living wage.
How much are they getting paid now?
Well, restaurant workers in 43 states now get what's called a tipped minimum wage, so they actually make less than the full minimum wage.
Wait, why is that?
Well, the practice of tipping started in Europe. In the 17th century coffee houses in England, the aristocrats would actually give a little something extra to the servers so that way they could ensure prompt service.
But here in the U.S., tippings come in and out of favor. Originally, after the Revolution, it was frowned upon. It was against the egalitarian spirit of the New Republic. But then later, it became an issue of race, gender, and class. A journalist in 1902 talked about how black people could take tips because that was expected of them. But it was because it was seen as a sign of a token of black inferiority, basically. And then conversely, to give money in the form of a tip to a white man was an embarrassment.
Yeah, attitudes in America actually began to change as a result of emancipation after the Civil War. Also, at that time, a lot of wealthy Americans were traveling on the new steamships to Europe, so they were seeing the European aristocrats do what they do, and then they were bringing those practices back to America. And then tipping really began to spread in post-Civil War America after Prohibition came into effect, when restaurants began to lose revenue from lost alcohol sales, and so it was viewed as a way to help them stay in business.
Interesting. So in the early 1900s, there's actually some states that even outlawed tipping. Did you know that?
Yeah, and actually it was only in 1926 that all those laws were repealed.
Yeah, and that was because of, Prohibition.
So what are the rules for tipping now?
So right now, tipping falls under the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which is like a landmark piece of legislation on the labor movement in the U.S. So right now, that's enforced by the Department of Labor, and tipping falls under the Wage and Hour Division.
Yeah, Section 3M of the Fair Labor Standards Act actually permits an employer to take a tip credit towards their minimum wage obligations for their tipped employees. But they can only take a tip credit equal to the actual amount that the tipped employee receives. And the wage that the tipped employee receives from their employer has to be at least $2.13 federally, although a lot of states, including New York, have a higher tipped minimum wage for tipped employees.
So in 2011, the Obama administration actually set the current rule, and that is an employee must retain all tips. But that doesn't preclude like a valid tip sharing or tip pooling arrangement with people who customarily receive tips, such as like bellboys, bellhops, counter personnel, waiters, waitresses, and service bartenders.
However, a valid tip pool cannot include employees who do not customarily and regularly receive tips, such as dishwashers, cooks, janitors, or chefs.
So right now, basically, you keep the tips that you make under the rule.
Wow.
So even though that's the current rule, in December of 2017, the Trump administration actually proposed a new rule.
A new rule?
Yeah, and under the proposed new rule, employers would be able to become the owners of all tips that their employees receive if they pay their employees the full minimum wage, and then the employer could redistribute those tips how they see fit, including to people who are currently kept out under the current rules.
But they could also tip themselves. So opponents kind of see this as a form of wage theft. They feel like you should be able to, keep the tips that you work for. They fear allow for like tip pocketing and to management, and create like a lack of transparency that doesn't allow them to receive the tips, and it will also decrease the tips in an industry that already really relies heavily on tips.
However, the supporters of the new rule are saying that it would help end the disparity between servers and back of the house staff, which admittedly there are some racial and class undertones to that too. But the National Restaurant Association has been the main force behind this rule, and that's the Employers Association. So we know that their main concern has not been for the workers.
But what about the workers?
The tip minimum wage does mean that workers who are paid less than the full minimum wage have to depend on the goodwill of their customers in order to make ends meet. And this, of course, has an especially hard impact on women workers, non-native English speakers, as well as people of color who tend to receive lower tips from customers. And the Restaurant Opportunity Center United, a workers' advocacy group, has documented that, servers experience especially high levels of harassment more than in any other industry, and that they often put up with it for the sake of their tips. These tips mean everything to these workers.
I feel like they earned that. They earned that. And they getting under the table, and that's how they live.
That's how servers make their money, through tips.
So last year, Trump's Department of Labor seemed to side with the Restaurant Association and a Ninth Circuit Court opinion, even though the Ninth Circuit Court later reversed its own decision. The agency proposed this new rule that would allow, in certain cases, tip pulling with back of the house employees to try to equalize inequalities. But this split means that the case might go to the Supreme Court. Right now, there's 2 cases that have petitioned the Supreme Court to address the issue of tip pooling. And SCOTUS hasn't decided to hear either case yet, but if they do decide to hear the case and reverse the Ninth Circuit decision, then tips would be able to be shared where an employee does not take a tip credit.
However, if the court upholds the Ninth Circuit case, then employers are prohibited from taking possession of the tips under all circumstances, whether or not they're taking a tip credit.
And so the Supreme Court decision, if they decide to hear the case, would be the last word, even surpassing, state laws. So in other words, the court's decision would trump the Department of Labor's regulations that were recently passed by the Trump administration.
So Trump would get trumped.
Yes.
So what's the current state of the proposed rule?
So the proposed rule was open for comments and received a large number. So much so that the Department of Labor extended the comment period by 30 additional days, and they received over 350,000 comments from stakeholders, including restaurant workers and other employees, and a majority of them seem to be against the proposed rule change.
So what's next?
Well, the Department of Labor didn't have the opportunity to address the rule because Congress actually acted first and included a provision in the omnibus spending bill that was just passed that addresses the issue and amends the Fair Labor Standards Act.
And basically, this prohibits restaurant owners from sharing tips with supervisors, managers, and themselves, regardless of whether the employee is taking a tip credit or not. But it will allow employers in some circumstances to share tips with dishwashers, cooks, and other back-of-the-house employees that traditionally have been underpaid and left out, in addition to their counterparts in the dining room, as long as those workers, though, receive full minimum wage.
And the new legislation is also leaving intact the Obama-era rule that prohibits tip pooling from being shared out to people who don't customarily and regularly receive it if the employer is going to take the tip credit. And Christine Owens from the National Employment Law Project has credited Representatives Rosa DeLauro and Catherine Clark with getting the measure passed, as their tough questioning of the Secretary of Labor during appropriations hearings opened the space for the bipartisan agreement. And in fact, just last week, Congress passed the measure and then it was signed into law on Friday.
So is that good for restaurant workers?
That was definitely good for restaurant workers.
Well, I'll definitely be tipping more than $2.
Solidarity forever.
Oh my God.